I used to tell myself I wasn't staying because I was scared. I was staying because I was smart. That's the word I used, like a shield. Smart people don't quit. Smart people don't burn bridges. Smart people don't step off a moving train just because they're tired. I said that for years, and it sounded responsible enough that no one questioned it, not even me. The building was an old, beige concrete slab on the edge of town, with narrow windows that made the hallways feel like winter even in July. Every morning I parked in the same spot, second row, under the dying light pole that flickered when the wind hit it. I'd sit for a minute with my hands on the steering wheel, watching people file in like the day was a bus schedule. Some of them looked awake. Most of them looked like they were already bracing. My routine was so tight it could have been printed on a badge. Coffee from the lobby kiosk that tasted like warm cardboard. Quick wave to the security guard who always called me boss, even though neither of us believed it. Elevator up, same desk, same muted hum from the fluorescent lights, same emails that arrived overnight like someone had dumped a bucket of small problems on my chair. And yet, on paper, it was a good job, stable, respectable, benefits that made my wife feel safer, a title that sounded better at dinner parties than it did in my own mouth. People relied on me. People knew my name. If you asked my neighbors, I was doing fine. Here's the part I didn't say out loud. I was afraid that if I left, I'd find out I wasn't special. I was afraid the comfort I'd built was actually a cage I'd gotten used to. I was afraid that the things I hated about my job weren't the job at all, but me, following the same pattern anywhere I went. The fear didn't show up as panic. It showed up as a calm little voice that sounded reasonable. Wait until after the bonus. Wait until after the project. Wait until after the holidays. The voice always had a date. It always had an excuse. And it always ended with the same lie. You're almost there. I remember the day the fear became visible. It was a Tuesday, the kind of gray day where the sky looks like a damp towel. My manager asked me to step into a small conference room with no windows, just a long table and a faint smell of dry erase marker. He slid a sheet of paper toward me, another reorg, another alignment, another shift of responsibility with no shift in pay. He talked about opportunity like it was a gift. I watched his mouth move and realized I wasn't listening. I was counting how many more years I could do this without hating the man I became. I signed the paper anyway. That's the hook, isn't it? The moment you realize you're unhappy and you still cooperate. The moment you see the trap and you politely step into it. The moment you think, this can't be my whole life, and then you go right back to your desk. At home, I played the part. I kissed my wife hello, asked about her day, listened to the normal stories, traffic, errands, something funny the dog did, and nodded in the right places. Then I'd drift toward the kitchen and open the mail like it was evidence, mortgage, utilities, a medical bill that wasn't supposed to be that high, a school fee, a reminder that the world doesn't pause because you're tired. I didn't tell her the truth. Not at first. The truth wasn't dramatic enough to justify the worry it would cause. I wasn't being screamed at. I wasn't being humiliated. I wasn't miserable in the way people understand on TV. I was slowly being turned into a version of myself that didn't care about anything except getting through the day without creating new problems. And that kind of misery is easy to hide because it looks like maturity. You call it responsibility. You call it loyalty. You call it providing. You call it being the kind of person who doesn't chase feelings. One night we were sitting at the table after dinner, the dishes still stacked, the house quiet in that way that makes you hear your own thoughts too clearly. My wife said casually, "You don't laugh much anymore." She didn't accuse me. She didn't plead. She just said it like she'd noticed the weather changing. I wanted to deny it. Instead, I stared at the grain in the wood, tracing the same lines over and over with my eyes. "Work's just been a lot," I said, like that explained the last 5 years. She reached across and touched my hand. "Is it still worth it?" That question hit me harder than any performance review. It wasn't, "Are they treating you okay?" It wasn't, "Do you need a vacation?" It was the question underneath all of it. What are you trading your life for, and are you getting what you paid for? I told her the numbers first because that's what I trusted. Salary, insurance, retirement match. I listed them like a defense attorney. She listened, patient, and then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "Those are reasons to stay," she said, "but they're not reasons to live." In my head, I heard the fear voice again. "If you leave, you lose everything." The fear voice is always loud when the room is quiet. The next morning, I pulled into my usual parking spot under the flickering light pole and sat there longer than usual. I watched my reflection in the rearview mirror and didn't like the man looking back. His eyes looked practiced, like he'd learned how to be absent while still showing up. In the lobby, the security guard called me boss again, and I felt embarrassed, like he'd given me a title I hadn't earned. I rode the elevator up with 2 younger guys from IT talking about a startup their friend had joined. They sounded excited in a way that made me feel both jealous and old. When the doors opened, the fluorescent hum hit me like a headache. I walked to my desk and saw my calendar. Meeting after meeting, blocks of time owned by other people. And I realized something simple and brutal. It's strange what finally breaks you. It's rarely the big insult. It's the small, steady disrespect that teaches you you're supposed to accept it. For me, it was a development conversation. My manager set it up like a gift, scheduled for 30 minutes on a Friday afternoon when everyone was already mentally gone. He sat across from me with a grin that was supposed to feel friendly, and he started talking about future leadership. He told me I was dependable. He told me I was the person he could count on when things got messy. He told me I kept the wheels on. Then he paused and said almost casually, "That's why we're going to need you to take on the new client onboarding process, just temporarily, until we stabilize." I waited for the part where he said what I'd get in return. He didn't. I asked, "What does that mean for my current workload?" He shrugged. "We'll see. You're good at managing it." That line landed like a confession. Not his confession, mine. I had trained these people that I would absorb anything. I would smile. I would solve it. I would make their problems disappear. And in return, they would keep asking me to do it. That wasn't cruelty. That was math. When I got back to my desk, I opened a spreadsheet I hadn't looked at in years. It was my escape spreadsheet. I'd made it back when I still believed you could plan your way out of fear. It had columns for savings, bills, insurance costs, and a little section called Runway. I hadn't touched it because touching it would mean admitting I wanted out. The numbers weren't terrible. We weren't rich, but we weren't reckless either. The truth I didn't want to face was that the money wasn't the main reason I stayed. The main reason was that I didn't know who I'd be without that job. My identity had fused with my responsibilities. If I removed the job, what was left? A husband? Sure. A father? Sure. But in my own head, I was the guy who handled things, the guy who didn't shake. I printed the spreadsheet anyway and folded it into my pocket like contraband. At lunch, I walked outside and sat in my car with the engine off. The parking lot smelled like hot asphalt and exhaust. I stared at that paper and felt my heart beat in my throat. The fear voice started listing disasters: no income, no coverage, humiliation, starting over at my age. Then another thought showed up, quieter but sharper. What if the disaster is staying? That was the first time I considered that staying wasn't neutral. Staying was a decision with a cost. Staying was also a gamble. I'd been acting like staying was the safe choice, but it was only safe if you ignore what it was doing to you. I went back inside, sat down, and wrote one sentence on a sticky note. Apply somewhere. Just that. Not quit, not leave. Something small enough that the fear voice couldn't laugh at it. That afternoon I applied for one job. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even let myself feel hopeful. I just did it like I was moving a chess piece. The first interview invitation arrived 2 weeks later. I saw the email subject line and my hands actually shook. Not from excitement, more like my body didn't trust me anymore. It was like it had learned that hope was dangerous. I read the message 3 times, then closed it, then opened it again, like the act of committing to a response might detonate something. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed with my laptop open and told my wife. I expected her to ask 1,000 questions. Instead, she just looked relieved, like she'd been waiting for me to admit I wanted something different. "You don't have to be brave forever," she said. The interview was on a video call, which meant I didn't have to drive to a strange building and sit in a lobby. That should have made it easier. It didn't. It made it worse, because I could see my own face in the corner of the screen. I kept adjusting the collar of my shirt, trying to make myself look like the confident version of me I used to be. The hiring manager was younger than me by at least 10 years. He was polite, sharp, and he asked good questions. He didn't treat my age like a problem, but I could feel myself projecting my fear onto him anyway. Every time I answered, I heard that little voice whispering, "You're too old to start over." Halfway through the call, he asked, "Why are you looking to leave?" I almost gave him the safe answer. Looking for growth. New challenges. The usual corporate poetry that says nothing. Instead, something honest came out. "I'm tired of being needed but not valued," I said. My throat tightened after I said it, like I'd broken a rule. He nodded slowly, like he recognized the sentence. "I've been there," he said. "That's not a small thing." When the call ended, I sat there staring at the blank screen. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exposed, like I'd shown someone the real reason I was stuck. The next day at work, my manager stopped by my desk to ask if I could quickly take ownership of another issue. He didn't ask if I had time. He assumed I would make time. I heard myself say yes before my brain had fully agreed. Then, in the quiet, after he walked away, I realized it's something new. Leaving wasn't just about getting another job. Leaving was about changing the habit that kept me trapped. The habit of automatically saying yes. The habit of earning my place by absorbing pain. That week, I set one boundary, a small one. When someone asked for a quick task at 4:45, I said, "I can do it first thing tomorrow. My heart pounded as if I'd committed a crime. No one yelled, no one threatened me. The world didn't end. But my body didn't know that yet. It had been trained for years to treat boundaries as danger. A second interview request arrived, then a third. Each one felt like stepping onto a bridge that might collapse. Each one made my fear louder and my hope steadier. The offer came on a Thursday at 11:12 a.m. I remember the exact time because I looked at the clock 3 times, like I couldn't trust the moment to be real. The salary wasn't wildly higher. The title wasn't dramatically better. The benefits were fine. What was different was the tone. The email wasn't written like they were doing me a favor. It was written like they wanted me. That detail felt almost embarrassing, like I'd forgotten what it was like to be chosen instead of tolerated. I printed the offer letter and put it in a folder. Then I stared at it for a long time. The fear voice immediately started negotiating. Don't rush. Ask for more time. Maybe this is a mistake. I walked to the bathroom and looked in the mirror, and I saw the same practiced eyes from the parking lot. But behind them there was something else now, a flicker of pride that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I called my wife from the stairwell so no one could hear. When I told her, she didn't scream or cry. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for years. Okay, she said, what do we need to do? That question grounded me. It turned the offer into a plan. I drafted my resignation email 5 different times. Each version sounded either too angry or too grateful. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to burn anything down. I just wanted to leave without turning into someone bitter. When I finally asked my manager for a private meeting, he looked annoyed, like I'd interrupted something important. We went back into that same small conference room with no windows, the room where I'd signed the reorg paper without feeling anything. This time, I felt everything. I handed him my resignation letter and watched his eyes scan it. He didn't look shocked. He looked inconvenienced. He asked where I was going. I told him the company name. He nodded as if it didn't matter, and then he said, "Can you give us 6 weeks? We're in a tight spot." 6 weeks. Just like that, he confirmed what I'd suspected. I wasn't a person to them. I was capacity. I was a container for tasks. I said, "Tim, 2 weeks." My voice didn't shake. That surprised me. He leaned back and tried a different angle. "I thought you were loyal," he said, half joking, half testing. There it was, the word that had kept me trapped, loyalty. I could have argued. I could have explained how many late nights I'd done, how many weekends, how many emergencies I'd cleaned up. Instead, I said one sentence, calm as I could manage. I said. I just stopped confusing loyalty with self-erasure. He stared at me like I'd spoken another language. When I walked out, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt lighter, like someone had taken a weight off my chest that I'd assumed was part of my skeleton. On my way back to my desk, I passed the security guard. He called me boss again. This time, I didn't feel embarrassed. The last 2 weeks were the strangest part. Nothing changed, and yet everything changed. I still came in, I still answered emails, I still attended meetings, but the job had lost its ability to define me. That's what freedom feels like at first. Not joy, but distance. People reacted in patterns. A few co-workers congratulated me with genuine warmth, the kind that made me realize they'd been quietly rooting for me. A few acted cold, like my decision was an accusation, Most just asked logistical questions because people are trained to treat departures like paperwork. My manager tried one more time to keep me. Not with a raise, more with guilt. "You're leaving us in a tough place," he said. We're going to struggle without you." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. The job always needed me. The job would always struggle. The job was a machine that would eat whatever you fed it and then ask for more. I told him, "I'll document everything I can," and I meant it. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was just done sacrificing myself to prove a point no one was keeping score of. At home, the mood shifted. My wife started talking about the future like it was something we were allowed to have. She asked what I wanted the first weekend after I started the new job. I didn't know how to answer. Wanting felt unfamiliar. I'd been operating on obligation for so long that desire felt childish, like a luxury. One evening I went for a walk after dinner and realized I was breathing differently. My shoulders weren't up by my ears. My jaw wasn't clenched. My mind wasn't replaying conversations I hated. The absence of dread was almost eerie. The day I turned in my badge, the hallway felt longer than usual. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me. I stopped at the security desk and placed the badge on the counter like it was a small surrender. The guard looked at it, then at me. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "New place," I said. He nodded. "Good. Don't get stuck." On my last afternoon, I cleaned out my desk. It didn't take long. That's another lie we tell ourselves, that our work is packed with meaning. Most of it is files, notes, and little office debris that someone else will throw away. I found the old escape spreadsheet printout in a drawer, folded and creased. I'd kept it as a reminder of the day I decided to move one chess piece. I held it for a moment, then tore it in half and tossed it in the trash. Not because I didn't respect the plan, because I didn't want to keep living like escape was the only way to feel alive. When I walked out of the building for the last time, the air outside felt sharper, like the world had been washed clean. I stood by my car and looked up at the narrow windows. I wondered how many other people were sitting inside, telling themselves they were smart for staying. Then I got in the car and drove away. No applause, no dramatic music, just an ordinary road and an unfamiliar calm. The new job wasn't perfect. There were still meetings and deadlines and people with opinions, but the difference showed up in small moments, the kind you only notice when you've lived the opposite. On my first week, I made a mistake, a real one. I missed a detail on a handoff, and it created a minor mess. In my old job, that kind of mistake would have turned into a quiet punishment, a colder tone, a new layer of scrutiny, a reminder that you were lucky to be there. Here, my manager called me and said, "Okay, what do we do next?" No shame, no theatrics, just problem solving. That's when I realized how much fear I'd been carrying as a normal part of work. Fear makes you efficient, sure, but it also makes you small. It makes you obedient. It makes you grateful for crumbs. One afternoon, I left at 5:10, not 7:30, not 9 o'clock, 5:10. I sat in my car and waited for the guilt to hit. It didn't. The sky was still bright. The day still belonged to me. I drove home and walked into the kitchen while the sun was still up. My wife looked at me like she was seeing a ghost. "You're early," she said, smiling. "I'm normal," I said, and it sounded strange in my mouth. Over the next few weeks, I kept noticing the same thing. I wasn't constantly proving I deserved to exist. I was doing work, and the work was enough. The job didn't require me to bleed to earn respect. That's when the regret arrived. Not regret about leaving, regret about how long I waited. I thought about the years I'd spent believing endurance was virtue, the vacations I'd half ruined because I kept checking my email, the nights I'd said just 5 more minutes, and then looked up and realized it was midnight. The times my kids asked me a question and I answered without looking up from my screen, like life was something happening in the background. I didn't beat myself up for it. I understood it now. I was afraid of losing stability, of being seen as reckless, of admitting I'd outgrown something that once fed me. I was afraid that wanting more was selfish. But here's the truth that hits hardest in hindsight. The job I was afraid to leave wasn't holding me there. I was. A month into the new job, a younger coworker asked me for advice. He said he'd been offered a role somewhere else, but he was nervous to take it. He said, "What if I make a mistake?" I paused before I answered, because I didn't want to hand him a slogan. I told him the only thing that was true for me. "The fear doesn't mean it's wrong," I said. The fear means it matters." He nodded, and I saw my old self in his face. I went back to my desk afterward and realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. Not because the world became safe, because I finally stopped asking a job to give me permission to live. Sometimes, months later, I still drive past the old building. It's hard to avoid. It sits right off the highway like a reminder you didn't request. The first few times I passed it, my stomach tightened, like my body remembered the old rhythm before my brain did. Then, slowly, that feeling faded, the way a bruise fades when you stop pressing on it. I used to believe leaving would feel like jumping off a cliff. What it really felt like was stepping out of a room that had slowly run out of oxygen. The biggest change wasn't my paycheck or my title. The biggest change was that I stopped living as if I had to earn rest. I stopped acting like exhaustion was proof of worth. I stopped accepting a life where the best part of my week was Friday afternoon relief. I don't tell people everyone should quit their job. That's not the point. The point is simpler. If you stay, make sure you're staying on purpose. Make sure you're not calling fear prudence just because it sounds nicer. When I think back to that windowless conference room, the paper sliding across the table, my hand signing without emotion, I understand what was happening. I wasn't numb because I didn't care. I was numb because I had trained myself not to feel anything that might force a decision. Decisions were dangerous. Decisions made you accountable for your life. Leaving didn't make me fearless. It made me honest. There's a difference. Fear still shows up. It just doesn't get to run the schedule anymore. A few weeks ago, my wife and I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd said, "You don't laugh much anymore." The light was different, warmer, softer, like the house had been waiting for me to come back to myself. She asked, "Do you remember how heavy you used to feel?" I did. I remembered the parking lot under the flickering light pole. I remembered the elevator doors opening to that fluorescent hum. I remembered the way my calendar looked like a cage made of meetings. I also remembered the day I applied for one job and felt a small shift inside me. That was the real beginning. Not the resignation, not the new offer. The moment I stopped treating my fear like a stop sign and started treating it like information. The job you're afraid to leave will always find a reason for you to stay. It will always have a deadline, a bonus, a crisis, a tight spot. The machine is designed to keep running. Your life isn't. The last time I drove past the old building, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumph. I felt gratitude for the years that taught me discipline, and for the moment I finally recognized the difference between being responsible and being trapped. Then I kept driving. That's the final change. I don't circle back anymore. That night I lay awake listening to the house settle, and I realized how long I'd been treating dread like a normal cost of adulthood. It didn't solve anything by itself, but it made the next step possible.